joining us on set to discuss these, especially as we pay attention to taxation on places of worship. We have attorney at law Vashisht Maraj with us. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure having you. We'd like to get your take on this particular contentious topic,
Yes.
property tax and taxation on places of worship. What is your take on this?
Well, my take is based on the legislation. So let's get the legislation in context before we proceed to discuss it. Section 16(1) of the Property Tax Act, that is the act that exists, says all lands in Trinidad and Tobago is liable to taxation under this act, subject to the following exceptions. A, lands used exclusively as churches, chapels, and places of public worship of any religious denomination. Pause. No mention of mosques, no mention of temples. So, on the face of it, all temples, all mosques are subject to taxation. Unless you can read into the words and places of public worship of any religious denomination, the word, the temple or mosque. So we need to look at the word denomination. What does the word denomination mean? Well, denomination refers to Christian denomination. The word denomination does not refer to Islam, nor does it refer to anybody, to Hinduism. The word denomination comes from the same root as the word denominator, if in fractions, which means to divide. So once the Christian church got divided into various groups, all of which have a common denominator, meaning the word of Christ,
Yes.
they were called denominational bodies. Hinduism, it goes on to say in the article, there were no denominations in the first century and for hundreds of years thereafter. The Lord did not establish any of these denominations, but man did. The word began 500 years ago. Hinduism and Islam existed before the word denomination. So you cannot, in my view, read into this section temple or mosque. I am reinforced in that belief when you go on to read the subsequent words of the same provision. It says, if I can continue,
Sure.
and every cemetery or burial ground that is enclosed and actually required and used and occupied for the interment of the dead. You would know Hindus cremate. So the section does not refer, it does not take into consideration the worship and practices of bodies other than those of the Christian faith. That is an indignity we have had to face. It is institutionalized discrimination that existed since 1920 in this country. 1920 is significant because it would have coincided with the abolition of indentureship. So in 1920, legislation was passed for the first time, taxing lands outside of the city of Port of Spain, the borough of San Fernando, Arima, and Point Forte. And that is when they brought in this whole question of not referring to Hindus or Muslims either explicitly or, I would submit, implicitly in the legislation. Now, we go on.
Sure.
If you look at section C and D of section 16, it says, land attached to or otherwise actually used in connection with and for the purposes of a place of learning maintained for education, educational, philanthropic, or religious purposes, the whole profit from which are devoted or applied to such purpose. Well, the wording is a little bit clumsy, but it may cover non-Christian faith. What is proposed in the draft bill is to delete that. So it's being deleted And what would therefore happen? It will no longer form part of the law. Then if you go at D and it says lands owned, occupied and used exclusively by an incorporated charitable institution. It is suggested that the last three words, incorporated charitable institution, be deleted, and this is what the draft bill is proposing. A charity exempt from corporation tax under section 61G of the Corporation Tax Act. What does 61G says? Profits of any ecclesiastical, charitable, or educational institution of a public character. Well, I don't think it takes a genius to figure out that ecclesiastical does not refer to Hindu Islam. Right. More importantly, why am I now having the president and by extension the Minister of Finance determine whether I'm a good Hindu body or not? Why does Mr. Imbert, because what will happen, or what happens under section 61G is that you have to supply the Ministry of Finance with the required information and you will be given tax exempt status. Why does Mr. Imbert want to control the taxation of Hindu bodies? Why? Why? You see, the power to tax includes the power to destroy. If you tax a body and I do not subscribe to payment of your taxes, justified or unjustified, you have the right to sell my property. You have this right, therefore, to destroy me as a body. Why does the minister want that power, or is seeking to amend the bill, the act by the bill, to abrogate unto himself that power? Why is the executive encroaching into religion in this country? Those are issues, I think, and that's why I'm thankful for the opportunity to raise them, is in need of national debate. And I think this piece of legislation has gone in the wrong direction. It started off on a wrong platform, and it has gone in the wrong direction. It started out on a platform that is based on the 1920 Property Tax Act, I think it's called Land and Building Taxes Act, which was passed by a colonial legislature, doomed and destined to destroy the growing landed class in the country, which is of East Indian ancestry. And this government has now sought to build on it. I think it's wrong. And I think Trinidadians of all denominations, as well as of non-Christian faith, should come forward and tell the government, do not intrude into taxation of religious bodies. Let me summarize what I'm saying. I think religious bodies should be free of property tax, corporation tax, and stamp duty. If I could just give you an example of what I am referring to. If you look at when the government decided to set up or to consent to the setting up of the law school in Trinidad, they passed an act in Parliament, Act number 41 of 1975, it's to establish the Council of Legal Education in Trinidad. If you go to the back of that act, you will see that there are several bodies. The second schedule of the act says the Council of Legal Education is exempt from 1, income tax, under the income tax ordinance, section 8. They are exempt from stamp duty, and they are listed in the schedule to the Stamp Duties Act. And 3, they are exempt from land and building taxes.
Why do you think that's the case? Why is it that they were afforded this?
Well, it's an inducement for them to establish the body in Trinidad. I think the question this raises, here is a professional school established not for the education exclusively of Trinidadians and Tobagonians, but established for the Caribbean people. Why is Trinidad bearing the responsibility or the cost of serving all the services that go to that institution? We are not deriving corporation tax from it. We are not deriving land and building tax. But it is imperative for this government to now tax religion and to tax religion.
What led to this? What do you think led to this?
Led to what? The taxation?
On the religious, yes.
I think it's an attempt by the executive to control religion's bodies in this country. Religion is a very powerful instrument of freeing people's minds, and it's an attempt to be able to control them. Well, as I told you, once you tax them, you can always get them into submission.
It's a very strong statement.
And can I repeat it?
So what is the way forward?
I think the only way forward is we must, as a society that is in crisis, see no benefit from taxation of religious bodies. I think we should do everything in our powers to encourage religious bodies to grow, to widen in scope, and to engulf more of Trinidad and Tobago. It is the only way we can prosper as a nation. And I do not say this as a practicing Hindu. I say it on behalf of the Shouter Baptists. I say it on behalf of Islam, all religious bodies in this country.
You mentioned there is need for a national debate, but is the public aware of all these details that you just highlighted?
I don't think they are. I think the debate has gone into a question of whether private places of worship will be exempt, because the assumption was that public temples are exempt. But you know, that brings another issue into focus. Do Hindus engage in public worship? Do Hindus, I want to quote from an article published in a magazine called Vedanta, Rituals as Opposed to Communal Worship. And this is what they say on page 4 of the article. Hindu rituals by its very nature is individual. The ritual is performed by one individual, a pujari, sometimes with the assistance of a prompter. Others, many or may not be present. Truly communal worship is almost non-existent. This reflects the Hindu emphasis on individual spiritual practices, which in turn allows each person to approach the divine in his or her own way. There are communal gatherings for scriptural discourses, satsangs, holy company, or devotional singing, but these are not ritualistic. And so the sense of being a member of a congregation has not developed. So when you talk about exempting places of public worship, that specifically hits or excludes temples that are not engaged in communal worship. When you go to a temple, you do your individual arati. You do your individual prayer to the Murti. I don't want to get into the question of symbolic worship and non-symbolic worship.
Yeah, I mean, I've been to the temple when I was little, and I remember there would be the pundit in the front, and there would be everybody else sitting and listening to the prayer.
Right.
And so you wouldn't classify that as a gathering?
No. And then at the end, he will invite people to come up and do arati and perform the thing. So at the end, he will invite everybody to do their individual worship. It's unlike a church. When you go to a church, the congregation is not invited to come, because by sitting in the congregation and the priest performing everything at the altar, they are participating in communal worship.
Well, I've also been to a church, and I can tell you, it's fine. But it's actually quite similar as well. I mean, you'd listen to the pastor preach, and sometimes he'll make an altar call. You come up, and, you know, you get that opportunity for him to, you know, individually pray for you and that sort of thing as well. But, you know, I get what you're saying. So what do you think the next step is? Do you think people are angry or upset or even appalled at this particular development? And do you think it will definitely lead to a national debate?
I think people do not understand the implications yet of what is taking place. I think when they're going to get angry and when they're going to get appalled is when the taxation bites and they realize that they are now subject to taxation. And they can say, well, the minister said so and so, and the minister said A and B. And ministers change. And the new minister, if there's a new minister, can say, well, listen, I am bound by the words of the legislation. And you show me where in the words of the legislation it says a temple, be it public or private, is exempt from taxation under the Property Tax Act.
Now, in talking about that, the annual rental value and the method that they use to develop this, what are your thoughts on that? How easy is this going to be rolled out?
Well, specifically, how do you determine an annual rental value of a temple? You know, I think it's absurd. Nobody rents a temple. I mean, in the sense of like an apartment or commercial premises or something like that. Yes, you may book a temple hall for the purposes of an occasion, but nobody rents a temple as such. And in any event, if you do, the proceeds of it go to charitable purpose. Why are we applying that sort of rating to a temple? And what are we going to do? If they do not pay this tax, we're going to sell the temple by public auction, or we're going to foreclose on it and put it up for sale by private treaty? What's going to happen if the temple defaults?
So you can definitely foresee some kinks along the way. Do you realistically think that this would actually take place?
I think there's the potential for it. How this is going to come to fore in situations where there is a real advantage politically, and I don't think that is an option we should allow to stay on the statutes books of this country.
Okay. Well, as we come to the end of this conversation, what are your closing comments?
It is time we stop the taxation of religion and allow people to practice their religions freely in this society.
Thank you so much, Attorney at Law Vashisht Maraj, for informing us, educating us a little bit about some of the details and definitions is definitely important as well. Thank you so much. We take a short break. A lot more when we return. Stay tuned.